Barren Spoken Promise. Abigail Abby Tate had spent years running, but when a storm forced her into Ethan Boone's cabin, she realized she might have just run straight into danger. He watched her from across the fire, voice rough as the wind outside. "You got nowhere else to go, do you?" he murmured. "Reckon you'll be staying here then." Chapter 1. The Storm's Embrace and a Reluctant Refuge. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at Abigail Tate's threadbare cloak as she urged her weary mare, Bess, onward. The sky, a bruised purple-black, wept a stinging rain that mingled with the dust of the plains, turning the trail into a treacherous, sucking mire. Abby hadn't planned on being caught in this squall. She'd hoped to reach Silver Creek by nightfall, but the storm, swift and brutal as a striking viper, had overtaken her. Silver Creek, and the dubious promise of anonymity it held, felt a lifetime away. Each gust threatened to rip her from the saddle, and the relentless downpour plastered her already damp, graying brown hair to her forehead. Abby, at 58, felt every one of her years tonight. The lines etched around her eyes, usually softened by a ready smile, were deepened by the strain of the ride and the ever-present knot of fear that resided in her chest. She'd been running for so long, from a past that clung to her like the scent of wood smoke, that the running itself had become a part of her. Bess stumbled, nearly throwing Abby, and a jolt of fear, sharper than the icy rain, pierced her. She couldn't afford to lose Bess. The mare was her only companion, her only link to a life that was rapidly dissolving behind her. "Easy, girl," Abby murmured, her voice raspy, almost lost in the wind's roar. She patted the mare's neck, feeling the tremor in the animal's powerful muscles. Through the driving rain, a faint, flickering light appeared, a beacon in the swirling darkness. Hope, fragile as a newborn bird, fluttered in Abby's chest. It was a cabin, set back from the trail, nestled against a low rise of rock that offered some small protection from the elements. Smoke curled from its chimney, a testament to warmth and, perhaps, safety. But safety was a luxury Abby had known for a long time. Trust was a currency she couldn't afford. Every stranger was a potential threat, every outstretched hand a possible trap. Yet, the alternative was to succumb to the storm, to be swallowed whole by the unforgiving wilderness. The choice, if it could even be called a choice, was clear. She guided Bess towards the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. As she drew closer, she could make out the rough-hewn logs, the single, small window glowing with the amber light of a fire. A crude corral stood beside the cabin, empty save for a stack of weathered firewood. There was no sign of life, but the smoke promised someone was inside. Abby dismounted, her stiff joints protesting with a chorus of aches. She tied Bess to a hitching post, offering the mare a reassuring pat and a whispered promise of rest. Then, drawing a deep breath, she approached the cabin door. It was made of thick, weathered planks, reinforced with iron straps. No fancy carvings, no welcoming ports. Just a stark, functional barrier against the world. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the rough wood. What awaited her inside? A kindly homesteader, willing to offer shelter to a weary traveler? Or something far more dangerous? The past had taught her to expect the latter. But the cold, the rain, the bone-deep exhaustion, they all conspired to push her forward. She knocked, the sound surprisingly loud in the relative quiet between gusts of wind. Silence. She knocked again, harder this time, her knuckles rapping against the wood with a desperate urgency. The door creaked open, slowly, revealing a sliver of the interior. The firelight danced, casting long, flickering shadows. And then she saw him. He was tall, silhouetted against the fire, his features obscured by the darkness. But she could sense his presence, the sheer force of it, filling the small space. He held a rifle, not pointed at her, but held ready. A precaution, not a threat. Not yet, anyway. He stepped forward, into the light, and Abby caught her breath. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 30s, though the hard lines of his face and the weariness in his eyes made him seem older. His hair was dark, almost black, streaked with silver at the temples, and it fell to his shoulders in unruly waves. He had a strong jaw, shadowed by several days' growth of beard, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of the storm-tossed sky, a deep, turbulent gray, and they seemed to see right through her, stripping away her defenses, laying bare the fear and exhaustion she tried so hard to conceal. He didn't speak for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her soaked clothes, her weathered face, the lines of worry etched around her mouth. He saw the desperation, the weariness, the faint tremor in her hands. He saw, she realized with a sinking heart, a woman who was running from something. Finally, his voice, rough as the wind outside, broke the silence. "You got nowhere else to go, do you?" he murmured. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. A recognition of a shared predicament, perhaps. Abby swallowed, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. "No," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "No, I don't." He studied her for another moment, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow nod, he stepped aside, gesturing with the rifle towards the interior of the cabin. "Reckon you'll be staying here, then." It wasn't an invitation, not exactly. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance of the inevitable. And as Abby stepped across the threshold, into the warmth of the cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just run straight into danger, a different kind of storm, perhaps, but a storm nonetheless. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, and in the silence, she could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock, a sound that seemed to mark the slow, inexorable passage of time and the uncertain future that awaited her. Outside, the wind was still howling as if some lonesome spirit was crying over what was and what was yet to come. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past and Flickering Flames. The cabin was small, Spartan, but surprisingly clean. A single room served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, the fire within casting a warm, flickering glow that pushed back the encroaching darkness. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room, and a narrow bed was tucked into a corner, covered with a thick, patchwork quilt. A few shelves held a meager collection of supplies, tins of food, a coffee pot, a few well-worn books. A rifle hung above the fireplace, a twin to the one he held. Everything was functional, practical, devoid of any unnecessary ornamentation. It spoke of a life lived on the edge, a life where survival was the only luxury. Ethan Boone, she hadn't asked his name, but it felt right, somehow, like a name carved from the very landscape hadn't spoken since letting her in. He'd simply gestured towards a chair by the fire, then moved to the opposite side of the hearth, placing his rifle against the wall within easy reach. He stood there, watching her, his storm-gray eyes still holding that unsettling intensity. Abby shed her wet cloak, draping it over the back of the chair. Her clothes, though damp, were beginning to dry in the heat of the fire. She shivered, not entirely from the cold. The silence in the cabin was thick, heavy, punctuated only by the crackling of the flames and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. It was an old clock, its wooden case worn and scratched, the brass pendulum swinging with a slow, deliberate motion. It seemed to measure the silence, the tension, the unspoken questions that hung in the air. She tried to meet his gaze, to offer a tentative smile, but her lips felt stiff, her face frozen in a mask of apprehension. She cleared her throat. "Thank you," she said, her voice still raspy.
For letting me in."
He nodded, a curt, almost imperceptible movement of his head. "Storm's not fit for man nor beast," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in the small space. He poured coffee from a blackened pot that hung over the fire, offering her a tin cup. The coffee was strong, bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out. She wrapped her hands around the cup, savoring the heat. "I'm Abigail," she said, finally breaking the silence. "Abigail Tate." He took a long sip of his own coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. "Ethan Boone," he replied, his voice revealing nothing. The name stirred something within her, a faint flicker of recognition, a whisper from a past she'd tried so hard to bury. But she couldn't place it, couldn't grasp the fleeting memory. She pushed it aside, telling herself it was just the exhaustion, the storm, the unsettling presence of this man. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, the fire casting dancing shadows on their faces. Abby watched him surreptitiously, trying to glean some clue about his character, his intentions. He was a hard man, she could see that. Life on the frontier had etched its mark on him, in the lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the calloused hands that gripped his coffee cup. But there was something else there, too, a hint of sadness, a vulnerability that he kept carefully hidden. He, in turn, seemed to be assessing her, weighing her up, trying to decipher the secrets she held. She knew what he saw, a woman past her prime, worn down by hardship, her clothes threadbare, her face etched with the map of a difficult life. He saw the fear in her eyes, the guarded way she held herself. He saw a woman who was running. "What are you running from, Abigail Tate?" he asked, his voice sudden and sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. The question startled her, and she almost dropped her cup. She looked at him, her heart pounding. Had he read her mind? How could he know? She hesitated, unsure how to answer. The truth was too dangerous, too complicated. She couldn't risk revealing it to a stranger, especially not to a man like Ethan Boone. "The storm," she said finally, her voice a shaky whisper. "I was running from the storm." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of skepticism in his eyes. "That all?" She nodded, trying to maintain a semblance of composure. "That's all." He didn't press her, but she knew he didn't believe her. He simply stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. The silence returned, heavier now, filled with unspoken accusations and unanswered questions. Abby finished her coffee, the warmth doing little to ease the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She felt exposed, vulnerable, under his intense scrutiny. She longed to escape, to be back on the trail, even in the midst of the storm. But she was trapped, not just by the weather, but by the unspoken power this man held over her. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked on, each tick a reminder of the passing time, of the danger she was in, of the past that was closing in on her. And as the flames danced and the shadows deepened, Abby wondered if she had found shelter from one storm only to be caught in another, far more dangerous one. The wind howled outside, a mournful cry that echoed the turmoil in her own heart. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Wind and Guarded Hearts. The hours stretched on, marked only by the crackling fire and the steady tick-tock of the old clock. Ethan offered Abby some dried meat and hardtack, a simple but filling meal. They ate in silence, the unspoken tension between them as thick as the smoke curling from the chimney. Abby found herself stealing glances at him, trying to decipher the enigma he presented. His rugged features, softened by the firelight, held a hint of melancholy, a deep-seated weariness that resonated with her own. He hadn't asked her again about what she was running from, but she knew the question still hung in the air, a silent challenge. She, in turn, found herself increasingly curious about him. What had brought him to this isolated cabin? What secrets did he harbor beneath that stoic exterior? The silence, while heavy, was also a strange comfort. It allowed her to gather her thoughts, to try and regain some semblance of control over the fear that threatened to consume her. As the night deepened, the storm outside began to abate. The wind died down to a low moan, and the rain softened to a gentle drizzle. Abby could hear the faint drip, drip, drip of water from the eaves, a soothing counterpoint to the crackling fire. Ethan rose and added more wood to the fire, the flames leaping higher, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He moved with a quiet grace, a natural economy of motion that spoke of a life lived in close contact with the land. "The storm's passing," he said, his voice low, almost a murmur. "You can sleep by the fire. I'll take the bed." It wasn't an offer, but a statement of fact. Abby hesitated. The thought of sleeping so close to him, of being so vulnerable in his presence, filled her with a renewed wave of apprehension. But the exhaustion was overwhelming, and the fire offered a warmth she desperately craved. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. He nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he turned away. He retrieved a thick blanket from a chest at the foot of the bed and tossed it to her. "You'll need this.
Gets cold at night."
Abby caught the blanket, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was brief, fleeting, but it sent a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. She quickly averted her gaze, her heart beating a little faster. She arranged the blanket on the floor near the hearth, settling down as best she could. The floor was hard, but the warmth of the fire was comforting. She lay there, listening to the sounds of the night, the crackling flames, the gentle drip of the rain, the occasional creak of the cabin as it settled. And, above all, the steady, rhythmic breathing of Ethan Boone, asleep in the bed across the room. She couldn't sleep. Her mind was racing, replaying the events of the day, the fear, the uncertainty, the unsettling presence of this man. She thought of the life she had left behind, the life she had been forced to abandon. The memories, sharp and painful, washed over her, bringing with them a wave of grief and regret. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the images, the voices, the ghosts of the past. But they were relentless, clinging to her like shadows. She saw the faces of her loved ones, the faces she might never see again. She heard their laughter, their cries, their whispered pleas. And then, she heard another sound, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It was her name, spoken softly, urgently. She sat up, her heart pounding, her eyes searching the darkness. Was it just the wind? Or was it something more? She listened intently, straining to hear above the crackling fire. There it was again, a faint whisper, barely audible. Abigail, it seemed to come from outside, from the direction of the window. She rose, her legs shaky, and moved towards the window, peering out into the darkness. The rain had stopped, and the moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, cast a pale, ethereal light on the landscape. She saw nothing, no one. Just the wind rustling through the trees, the dripping eaves, the vast, empty expanse of the plains. But the whisper persisted, a faint, haunting murmur that seemed to call to her, to draw her out into the night. It was a voice she recognized, a voice from her past, a voice that filled her with both fear and longing. A voice that shouldn't be here. A voice that couldn't be here. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her breath fogging the pain. Was she losing her mind? Was the stress, the exhaustion, finally taking its toll? Or was something else at play, something far more sinister? She didn't know. But as she stood there, staring out into the darkness, listening to the whispers on the wind, she felt a growing sense of dread, a certainty that the danger she had been running from had finally caught up with her. Even Ethan's slow, steady breathing from the bed seemed to hold a warning, an underlying tension that spoke of hidden dangers and unspoken fears. The fire was dying down, and with it, the illusion of safety. Chapter 4. The Weight of Silence and Unspoken Truths. The whisper, if it had ever been truly there, faded with the first tentative rays of dawn. Abby hadn't slept, her mind a whirlwind of fear and fragmented memories. The faint light creeping through the window revealed the cabin in stark detail, dispelling the shadows of the night, but doing little to ease the shadows in her heart. Ethan was already awake, moving about the cabin with a quiet efficiency. He had rekindled the fire, and the aroma of coffee filled the small space. He didn't speak, didn't even glance at her as she sat up, stiff and aching from her night on the hard floor. The silence, once a strange comfort, now felt oppressive, a heavy weight pressing down on her. She watched him as he prepared a simple breakfast of coffee and hardtack, his movements practiced and economical. He was a man of few words, she realized, a man who kept his thoughts and feelings tightly guarded. He offered her a cup of coffee and a piece of hardtack, his gaze meeting hers for a brief moment. His eyes, the color of a stormy dawn, held a question, a silent inquiry. She wondered if he had heard anything during the night, if he had sensed her fear. "Thank you," she murmured, accepting the offering. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it helped to chase away the lingering chill of the night. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the occasional clink of their tin cups. Abby found herself struggling to find words, to break the heavy silence. The events of the night, the whispers she thought she'd heard, had left her shaken, uncertain. Did you hear anything last night?" she asked finally, her voice hesitant. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Hear what?" She hesitated, unsure how to explain. "A voice, a whisper. I thought I heard someone calling my name." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense. "The wind plays tricks out here," he said finally, his voice flat. "Especially at night." He didn't dismiss her entirely, but he didn't offer any reassurance either. She wondered if he believed her, or if he thought she was simply imagining things. "It sounded familiar," she persisted, her voice barely a whisper. "Like someone I knew." He turned away, busying himself with cleaning up the meager breakfast. "The past is best left buried, Abigail," he said, his voice low and hard. "It has a way of haunting you if you let it." His words struck a chord within her, a painful resonance. He was right, of course. The past was a dangerous place, a minefield of regrets and lost dreams. But it was also a part of her, an inescapable part of who she was. The silence returned, heavier now, filled with unspoken truths and hidden pain. Abby felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that she was caught in a web of secrets, both her own and Ethan's. He finished cleaning up, then retrieved his rifle from the wall. "I'm going out to check the perimeter," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Stay inside." It wasn't a suggestion, but a command. Abby nodded, watching him as he left the cabin, his tall figure disappearing into the early morning mist. She was alone again, left with her thoughts and her fears. The cabin, which had seemed like a refuge the night before, now felt like a cage. She paced restlessly, her mind racing. Who was Ethan Boone? And why was he so determined to keep his past hidden? She examined the cabin more closely, searching for some clue, some insight into the man who had offered her shelter. There was nothing personal, nothing to indicate his history or his character. Just the bare essentials, the tools of survival. Except on the mantelpiece, above the clock, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small, wooden carving, almost hidden in the shadows. She reached up and took it down, examining it closely. It was a carving of a bird, a hawk, its wings outstretched in flight. It was beautifully crafted, the details intricate and precise. It was out of place in this Spartan cabin, a touch of artistry in a world of harsh practicality. As she held the carving in her hand, she felt a strange connection to Ethan, a sense of shared loss, of a shared longing for something beyond the harsh realities of their lives. She heard the sound of footsteps outside and quickly replaced the carving on the mantelpiece. Ethan entered the cabin, his face grim, his eyes dark with a troubled intensity she could not, and maybe did not want to, completely understand. The silence lingered, a third presence in the room, heavy with all that remained unspoken between them, and a gathering storm of secrets. He had seen something, or even worse, sensed something dangerous. Chapter 5. Echoes of Loss and a Glimmer of Trust. Ethan didn't speak of what he'd seen or sensed outside. He simply stood by the door, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of the cabin, his body tense, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his shoulder. The silence stretched, thick and uneasy, punctuated only by the steady tick-tock of the clock. Abby watched him, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The carving of the hawk, now back on the mantelpiece, seemed to pulse with a silent energy, a tangible link between them. She wanted to ask him about it, to break through the wall of silence he had erected, but the words caught in her throat. Finally, he turned, his gaze meeting hers. The storm in his eyes had subsided, replaced by a deep, unsettling sadness. "There were tracks," he said, his voice low and rough. "Not far from here. Horses." Several of them. Abby felt a chill run down her spine. Tracks horses. It could be anyone, anything. But the fear, the instinctive, gut-wrenching fear, told her otherwise. It was them. They had found her.
Who do you think it was?
She asked, her voice trembling. He shrugged, a gesture that conveyed both uncertainty and a grim acceptance. Could be anyone. Renegades. Outlaws. Or, he didn't finish the sentence, but she knew what he was thinking. Or the men she was running from. He moved to the fireplace, adding more wood to the dwindling flames. The fire leaped higher, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the flames. Abby watched him, her mind racing. She had to tell him, she realized. She couldn't keep the truth from him any longer. The danger was too close, too real. She needed his help, his protection. Ethan, she began, her voice hesitant, there's something I need to tell you. He looked at her, his expression questioning, but not unkind. He seemed to sense the weight of her words, the burden she carried. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. I'm not just running from a storm, she said, her voice gaining strength. I'm running from men. Dangerous men. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. I figured as much. She told him everything then. The whole story, the story she had kept buried for so long. She told him about her husband, a wealthy rancher, a man of power and influence. A man who had been murdered, brutally, and the false accusation pointing toward her. She told him about the men who were hunting her, men who were loyal to her husband's memory, men who believed she was guilty, men who wanted revenge. She spoke of the fear, the desperation, the constant running. She spoke of the loss, the grief, the betrayal. She spoke of the hope, the fragile hope, that she could somehow find a way to clear her name, to find justice, to find peace. As she spoke, the tears came, unbidden, streaming down her face. She hadn't cried in a long time, hadn't allowed herself the luxury of grief. But now, in the presence of this silent, watchful man, the dam had broken. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression unchanging. He simply sat there, by the fire, his gaze fixed on her face, absorbing her words, her pain, her fear. When she was finished, the silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a silence of understanding, of shared sorrow, of a tentative, fragile trust. He finally spoke, his voice low and gentle. I believe you, Abigail. The words, simple as they were like a balm to her wounded soul. She had expected suspicion, doubt, perhaps even rejection. But he believed her. He rose and moved towards her, his tall figure casting a shadow over her. She flinched instinctively, expecting she didn't know what. But he simply reached out and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. His hand was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who worked the land, the hand of a man who knew hardship. I'll help you, he said, his voice firm, resolute. I won't let them take you. His words, his touch, his gaze, they all conveyed a promise, a commitment, a bond. And in that moment, Abby felt a glimmer of hope, a spark of warmth in the cold, dark wilderness of her life. The fire crackled, a cheerful sound now, and the clock ticked on, measuring not the passage of time, but the slow, steady growth of something new, something precious, something that felt like the beginning of trust. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting long, golden rays across the land, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent promise of a new day, a new beginning. Chapter 6. A shared meal and the thaw of frozen fears. The shared confession, the unspoken promise of protection, had shifted the dynamic between them. The oppressive silence that had characterized their earlier interactions was gone, replaced by an easier, if still cautious, understanding. Ethan, while still a man of few words, seemed less guarded, his gaze less intense. Abby, in turn, felt a lessening of the fear that had gripped her since entering the cabin. Ethan prepared a more substantial meal than the previous day's hardtack and dried meat. He produced some flour, dried beans, and a small piece of salt pork from his meager stores. Abby watched him, fascinated by his efficiency and resourcefulness. He moved with a quiet confidence, his hands deft and sure. "Can I help?" she asked, feeling a need to contribute, to be more than just a burden. He glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "You know how to cook?" She smiled, a genuine smile, the first one he had seen. "I used to run a household, Ethan. I know my way around a kitchen, even a rudimentary one." He nodded, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "All right then. You can make the cornbread." They worked together side by side in the small cabin. Abby mixed the flour, water, and a pinch of salt, kneading the dough with practiced ease. Ethan tended to the beans and salt pork, simmering them in a pot over the fire. The simple act of preparing a meal together, of sharing a common task, created a sense of normalcy, a feeling of connection. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable now, filled with a quiet understanding. Abby found herself observing Ethan, studying his movements, his expressions. She noticed the small details she hadn't seen before, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the slight curve of his lips when he was satisfied with his work, the way his eyes, usually so guarded, softened when he looked at the fire. He was a complex man, she realized, a man of hidden depths. He was strong and capable, but also vulnerable, carrying a burden of his own. She wondered about his past, about the events that had brought him to this isolated cabin. As they worked, the aroma of cooking food filled the cabin, a comforting, familiar scent. It reminded Abby of her old life, of the meals she had prepared for her husband, for her family. The memories brought a pang of sadness, but it was a bittersweet sadness, tempered by the present moment, by the warmth of the fire, by the presence of Ethan. When the meal was ready, they sat at the rough-hewn table, facing each other. The cornbread was golden brown and crumbly, the beans and salt pork savory and filling. It was a simple meal, but it tasted like a feast. "This is good," Ethan said, his voice sincere. "Better than I could have done." Abby smiled, pleased by his compliment. "It's just simple fare, but it's filling." They ate in silence for a while, savoring the food, the warmth, the companionship. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked on, a steady, reassuring presence. "You never told me why you're out here," Abby said finally, breaking the silence. "Why this cabin's so far from everything?" He looked at her, his expression guarded. He hesitated, as if unsure whether to share his story. "It's a long story," he said finally, his voice low. "I have time," she replied, her voice gentle. He took a deep breath, then began to speak. He told her about his life, a life that had been marked by loss and hardship. He had been a rancher, like her husband, but he had lost everything, his wife, his child, his land. He had been betrayed by a friend, a man he had trusted. He had been forced to flee, to start over, to find a new life. His story echoed her own in many ways. A story of loss, of betrayal, of running. A story of trying to find peace, to find redemption, in a harsh and unforgiving world. As he spoke, Abby felt a growing sense of empathy, of understanding. She saw the pain in his eyes, the weariness in his voice, the burden he carried. She saw a man who had been broken, but not defeated. A man who was still searching for something, for a reason to keep going. And in his story, she saw a reflection of her own. She saw the possibility of healing, of finding a new purpose, of building a new life. The shared meal, the shared stories, had melted away a significant layer of the fear and mistrust that had initially filled the cabin. They were two wounded souls, finding solace in each other's company, finding a glimmer of hope in the shared darkness of their pasts. The cornbread was almost gone, and the beans were cold, but neither of them noticed. The warmth came from within, a slow thaw of frozen hearts beginning under the watchful eye of the ticking clock. Chapter 7. The Ghost of Redemption and a Haunting Melody. The days that followed settled into a quiet routine. Ethan spent his time tending to the small, neglected garden behind the cabin, hunting for game, and keeping a watchful eye on the surrounding landscape. Abby helped with the chores, cleaning the cabin, cooking the meals, and tending to Bess, who seemed to have recovered from her ordeal in the storm. The nights were the most difficult. The silence, the darkness, the memories, they all conspired to keep Abby awake, tossing and turning on her makeshift bed by the fire. Ethan, too. Ethan, who had been outside chopping wood, rushed back inside, his face grim, his rifle in hand.
"Get down," he ordered, his voice urgent.
Abby didn't hesitate. She dropped to the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. The gunfire continued, sporadic but closer now. Ethan peered out the window, his body tense, his eyes scanning the landscape. "It's them," he said, his voice low and hard. "They've found us." Abby felt a surge of fear, cold and paralyzing. She had known this moment would come, but she had hoped, foolishly, that it wouldn't. That she could somehow escape her past, find a new life with Ethan. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We fight," he replied, his voice resolute.
"We have to."
He checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded. He handed her a smaller pistol, one she had seen hanging on the wall. "Do you know how to use this?" She nodded, her hand shaking as she took the pistol. She had learned to shoot years ago, out of necessity, living on the frontier. But she had never fired a gun at another person.
"Stay here," he said.
"And don't shoot unless you have to." He moved to the door, his body silhouetted against the light. He paused, his hand on the latch, and looked back at her. His eyes, usually so guarded, were filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice low, "remember you're not alone." Then he was gone, disappearing into the harsh sunlight. Abby remained crouched by the window, her heart pounding, her hand gripping the pistol. The gunfire continued, closer now, punctuated by shouts and the thud of hooves. She peered out the window, trying to see what was happening. She saw Ethan moving swiftly, taking cover behind rocks and trees. She saw other figures, men on horseback, firing their guns. She saw the dust and the smoke, the chaos of the battle. She wanted to help, to join him, but she knew she would be more of a hindrance than a help. She was a liability, a burden. He was protecting her, risking his life for hers. She closed her eyes, praying for his safety, praying for a miracle. She thought of her past, of the mistakes she had made, of the life she had lost. She thought of Ethan, of the kindness he had shown her, of the hope he had given her. And then she heard a sound, a sharp crack, followed by a cry of pain. Her eyes flew open, and she saw Ethan, falling to the ground, his hand clutching his arm.
She didn't hesitate.
She rose, ignoring the fear that threatened to consume her, and ran outside, towards him. The men on horseback saw her, and they turned their attention to her, their guns raised. She fired the pistol, blindly, desperately. She didn't know if she hit anyone, but it didn't matter. She reached Ethan, dropping to her knees beside him. He was alive, but his arm was bleeding badly. "Ethan," she cried, her voice choked with sobs. "Ethan, I'm here." He looked at her, his face pale, his eyes filled with pain. "Abigail, you shouldn't have. I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "I'm not running anymore." She tore a strip of cloth from her skirt and tied it around his arm, trying to stem the bleeding. She looked up, defiance flashing. The men were closing in, their faces grim, their guns pointed at her. She raised the pistol, her hand shaking, but her resolve firm. She would fight. She would protect him. She would face her past, her fears, her demons. She looked them dead in the eyes, no longer the frightened, hunted woman. They would find Abigail had teeth. She was ready. The promise of dawn was a blood-red sky and the smell of gunpowder. This was her stand. Chapter 9. A ride through dust and the unveiling of secrets. The standoff was broken not by gunfire, but by the sudden appearance of a single rider galloping towards them from the direction of the setting sun. The rider, a silhouette against the fiery sky, shouted something unintelligible, and the men surrounding Abby and Ethan hesitated, their attention diverted. Abby used the momentary distraction to help Ethan to his feet. He was weak, his face pale, but he managed to stand, leaning heavily on her. "We need to get to Bess," she said, her voice urgent.
"Can you ride?"
He nodded, his jaw clenched in pain. "I can manage." They stumbled towards the corral, where Bess was pawing the ground nervously, her eyes wide with fear. Abby helped Ethan into the saddle, then quickly mounted behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. The single rider had reached them now, and Abby recognized him with a jolt of surprise. It was Sheriff Brody from Silver Creek, the town she had been heading towards when the storm had driven her to Ethan's cabin. Sheriff Brody, a tall, weathered man with a stern face and piercing blue eyes, dismounted and approached them, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "Ethan," he said, his voice gruff, "what in tarnation is going on here?" Ethan explained, his voice weak but steady, about the men who had attacked them, about Abby's past, about the false accusation that had driven her to flee. Sheriff Brody listened intently, his gaze shifting between Ethan and Abby. He seemed to recognize Abby, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Abigail Tate," he said, his voice heavy with accusation. "You're wanted for murder." Abby felt a surge of despair, a feeling that all hope was lost. She had been so close to finding refuge, to finding justice, and now but Ethan spoke up, his voice surprisingly strong. "She's innocent, Brody. I know it. These men, they're not interested in justice. They want revenge." Sheriff Brody studied Ethan, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be weighing his words, assessing the situation. Finally, he spoke, his voice firm. "I'm taking you both to Silver Creek," he said. "We'll sort this out there. I'll hear both sides of the story." It wasn't a reprieve, not exactly, but it was a chance. A chance to prove her innocence, a chance to finally clear her name. They rode through the gathering dusk, Sheriff Brody leading the way, Abby and Ethan following behind. The ride was long and arduous, Ethan struggling to stay in the saddle, Abby supporting him with all her strength. As they rode, Abby found herself thinking about Ethan, about the risk he had taken for her, about the bond that had formed between them. She had come to this cabin seeking shelter from a storm, but she had found something far more profound, a connection with another human being, a shared understanding, a glimmer of hope. The landscape around them was vast and empty, the sky above a canvas of stars. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves and the occasional sigh from Ethan. "Ethan," Abby said softly, "why did you do it?
"Why did you help me?"
He didn't answer for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I saw myself in you, Abigail," he said finally, his voice low. "I saw the same fear, the same desperation, the same longing for peace." He told her then, in a halting voice, about the details of his past, about the betrayal that had shattered his life. He had been a respected rancher, a loving husband, a devoted father. But his best friend, a man he had trusted implicitly, had coveted his wife, his land, his life. He had framed Ethan for a crime he didn't commit, turning the community against him, forcing him to flee. His wife and child had died, believing him to be a criminal. He had lost everything, his reputation, his family, his home. He had been living in the cabin, hiding from the world, nursing his grief and his anger. Abby listened, her heart aching for him. She understood his pain, his loss, his bitterness. She understood the weight of a false accusation, the burden of a shattered life. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said softly.
"I'm so sorry."
He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "We've both been through hell, Abigail," he said. "But maybe we can help each other find a way out." The ride continued, the stars their silent witnesses. The secrets they had unveiled to each other, the shared pain, the tentative trust they had forged a bond, a connection that transcended their individual struggles. They were two wounded souls, riding through the dust, seeking redemption, seeking justice, seeking a new dawn. As Silver Creek began to appear as just small, flickering lights, they were no longer two strangers running. They were two souls intertwined. Chapter 10. The Price of Freedom and a Desperate Plea. Silver Creek, in the pale light of dawn, was a far cry from the bustling town Abby had envisioned. It was smaller, dustier, more weathered, a testament to the harsh realities of frontier life. The buildings were mostly made of wood, their paint peeling, their roofs sagging. The streets were unpaved, churned into a muddy mire by the recent rains. Sheriff Brody led them to the jail, a small, sturdy building made of stone, located on the main street. The jail was also his office, sparsely furnished with a desk, a few chairs, and a gun rack on the wall. The two cells at the back were empty, their iron bars gleaming ominously in the dim light. Ethan, his arm bandaged and slinged, sat heavily on a chair, his face pale and drawn. Abby stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, a silent gesture of support. Sheriff Brody sat behind his desk, studying them both, his expression unreadable. He had listened to their stories during the ride, but he had remained non-committal, his duty outweighing any personal feelings. "Abigail Tate," he said, his voice formal, "you are accused of the murder of your husband, Clayton Tate. How do you plead?" Abby took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Not guilty," she said, her voice firm and clear. Sheriff Brody nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I've heard your story, and I've heard Ethan's account of what happened at the cabin. I also know Clayton Tate's brothers are powerful men, with a lot of influence in this territory." He paused, his gaze shifting to Ethan. "Ethan Boone, you are harboring a fugitive. That's a serious offense." Ethan met his gaze, his expression defiant. "I believe she's innocent, Brody. And I won't stand by and watch her be railroaded by those men." Sheriff Brody sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "This is a mess," he said. "A damn mess. I have a duty to uphold the law, but I also have a conscience." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Abigail, I'm going to give you a chance. I'm going to hold you here, in protective custody, while I investigate this matter. But I need your cooperation. I need you to tell me everything you know, every detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem." Abby nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "I will, Sheriff. I promise you I will." Sheriff Brody turned to Ethan. "Ethan, I'm releasing you for now. But I'm warning you, stay out of trouble. Don't do anything that will make my job harder." Ethan nodded, his expression grim. "I understand." Sheriff Brody locked Abby in one of the cells, the iron bars clanging shut with a finality that sent a chill down her spine. She was a prisoner, again, but this time it was different. This time, she had a chance, a glimmer of hope. Ethan lingered by the cell, his hand reaching through the bars to touch hers. "I'll be back, Abigail," he said, his voice low. "I promise you, I won't let you down." She squeezed his hand, her heart filled with gratitude and a growing affection for this man who had risked everything for her. "I know you won't, Ethan," she said softly. "Thank you." He left then, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the jail. Abby was alone, again, but she wasn't afraid. She had Ethan, she had Sheriff Brody's tentative trust, and she had her own determination to fight for her freedom, for her future. She sat on the narrow cot in the cell, her gaze fixed on the small, barred window. The sun was rising, casting a golden light on the dusty street outside. It was a new day, a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Abby felt a flicker of hope, a belief that she might actually survive this, that she might actually find peace. But as the hours passed, a growing sense of unease settled over her. Sheriff Brody hadn't returned, and the town outside was eerily quiet. She heard whispers, rumors, snippets of conversation that made her blood run cold. Clayton Tate's brothers were coming. They were powerful, ruthless men. And they were not interested in justice. They wanted revenge. And Sheriff Brody, one man against many, may not be able to stop them, especially if powerful forces were already moving against her, unseen, in the shadows. She made a desperate plea to the empty air. "Ethan, please hurry." Chapter 11. Blood on the horizon and a stand against the storm. The uneasy quiet of Silver Creek was shattered by the arrival of Clayton Tate's brothers. They rode into town like a storm, a thunder of hooves and a cloud of dust, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a cold, hard fury. There were 4 of them, each one as formidable and intimidating as the reputation that preceded them. Abby, watching from the barred window of her cell, felt a surge of fear, a cold dread that gripped her heart. She knew these men, knew their ruthlessness, their cruelty, their utter disregard for the law. Sheriff Brody, standing on the steps of the jail, his hand resting on his gun, tried to reason with them, to uphold the law, to maintain order. But they were beyond reason, beyond the reach of the law. They were driven by vengeance, by a thirst for blood. "We want the woman," Jed Tate, the eldest and most ruthless of the brothers, demanded, his voice harsh and unforgiving. "She killed our brother. We're taking her." Sheriff Brody stood his ground, his body tense, his eyes unwavering. "She's in my custody, Jed. I'm investigating the matter. You'll have to wait for the circuit judge." The brothers laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the dusty street. "The circuit judge?" Jed sneered. "We are the judge, jury, and executioner here." They dismounted, their spurs clinking on the wooden boardwalk, their hands hovering over their guns. The townsfolk, who had gathered to watch, scattered, seeking shelter in the nearby buildings. Abby watched, her heart pounding, her breath caught in her throat. She knew this was it, the final confrontation. Sheriff Brody, 1 man against 4, couldn't possibly win. She looked around the cell, desperately searching for something, anything, that she could use as a weapon. But there was nothing, just the narrow cot, the thin blanket, the cold, hard stone floor. She heard the sound of gunfire, a sharp, deafening crack that echoed through the jail. She saw Sheriff Brody fall, his body crumpling to the ground. The brothers stormed into the jail, their faces flushed with anger, their guns smoking. Jed Tate approached her cell, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You're coming with us, Abigail," he said, his voice a low growl. "And you're going to pay for what you did." Abby didn't answer. She stood tall, her head held high, her eyes filled with defiance. She was not afraid anymore. She had faced her fears, her past, her demons. She was ready to meet her fate, whatever it may be. But then, she heard another sound, a familiar voice, cutting through the chaos. "Let her go, Jed." It was Ethan. He stood in the doorway of the jail, his rifle leveled at the brothers, his face grim, his eyes blazing with a righteous fury. The brothers turned, surprised, their guns momentarily forgotten. Jed Tate sneered at Ethan. "You again, Boone? You're a fool to interfere. This is family business." Ethan didn't flinch. "She's innocent, Jed. You know it. This isn't justice. It's murder." The standoff was tense, the silence broken only by the heavy breathing of the men. Abby watched, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Ethan was outnumbered, outgunned. But he was also determined, resolute, willing to risk his life for hers. Suddenly, the sound of more horses, many more, filled the air. A group of riders, led by a familiar figure, galloped into town, their guns drawn. It was a group of ranchers, neighbors of Ethan's from before he lost everything. They had heard about what was happening, and they had come to help. They were men of the land, men of honor, men who believed in justice. The Tates were now outnumbered. Jed, realizing the tables have been turned, he lowered his weapon. All of the Tates followed. Ethan never lowered his rifle. "Get out of town," Ethan said, his voice cold and hard, all traces of softness or vulnerability gone, replaced by the steel of a man pushed too far. "And don't ever come back." The brothers, defeated and humiliated, mounted their horses and rode away, disappearing into the dust. The ranchers, led by their spokesman, a grizzled old man named Samuel, approached Ethan and Abby. "We heard you were in trouble, Ethan," Samuel said. "We came as fast as we could." Ethan nodded, his gaze softening. "Thank you, Samuel. Thank you all." He turned to Abby, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and concern. "Are you all right, Abigail?" She nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Ethan.
I'm all right.
Thanks to you." Sheriff Brody, who had only been wounded in the shoulder, was helped to his feet by some of the townsfolk. He looked at Ethan and Abby, his expression grim but grateful.
This isn't over, he said.
"But for now, you're both safe." The blood on the horizon was not hers, or Ethan's. It was the sunset, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, a fiery testament to the stand they had made, the battle they had won, the storm they had weathered. It was a promise of a new beginning, a new life, forged in the crucible of violence and redemption. Chapter 12. Broken Vows and the Reckoning of Betrayal. The immediate danger had passed, but the aftermath of the confrontation lingered like a shroud over Silver Creek. Sheriff Brody, his arm bandaged and in a sling, was determined to get to the bottom of Clayton Tate's murder and clear Abby's name once and for all. He began a thorough investigation, questioning the townsfolk, gathering evidence, piecing together the events of that fateful night. Abby, while no longer confined to the jail cell, remained in Silver Creek, staying in a small room above the saloon. Ethan, his own wound tended to, was a constant presence, a silent guardian, a steadfast friend. The investigation revealed a web of deceit, betrayal, and long-held secrets. It turned out that Clayton Tate had been a cruel and abusive husband, a man who had made many enemies. He had been involved in numerous shady dealings, land grabs, and cattle rustling operations. The most shocking revelation, however, came from a most unexpected source. Martha, the saloon owner, a woman who had seemed to be nothing more than a quiet observer, a background figure in the drama that had unfolded. Martha, a woman in her late 50s, with tired eyes and a weary smile, had been Clayton Tate's mistress for many years. She had been secretly in love with him, hoping that he would one day leave Abigail and marry her. But Clayton had never intended to leave Abigail. He had used Martha, manipulated her, and then discarded her when she became pregnant with his child. The child, a boy, had been born prematurely and had died shortly after birth. Martha, heartbroken and consumed by grief and anger, had plotted her revenge. She had waited for the right moment, and then, on the night of Clayton's murder, she had poisoned his whiskey, slipping a deadly concoction into his drink. She had framed Abigail, knowing that she would be the prime suspect. She had planted evidence, spread rumors, and manipulated the Tate brothers into believing in Abigail's guilt. Martha confessed everything to Sheriff Brody, her voice filled with a mixture of remorse and defiance. She had been driven by love, by loss, by a desperate desire for justice. Abby, listening to Martha's confession, felt a strange mixture of emotions: shock, disbelief, pity, and a profound sadness. She had been wronged, terribly wronged, but she could also understand Martha's pain, her desperation, her twisted sense of justice. Ethan, standing beside Abby, his hand resting on her shoulder, offered a silent support. He had listened to Martha's confession without judgment, without condemnation. He understood the complexities of human nature, the darkness that could reside in even the most wounded hearts. Sheriff Brody, faced with this new evidence, had no choice but to arrest Martha. He took her into custody, his expression grim, his heart heavy with the weight of his duty. Abby was finally free, her name cleared, her innocence proven. But the victory felt hollow, tinged with sadness. The price of her freedom had been high, paid for with the lives and suffering of others. The Tate brothers, confronted with the truth, were forced to accept Abigail's innocence. They apologized, their voices filled with shame and regret. They had been blinded by vengeance, manipulated by lies, driven by a false sense of loyalty. As Abby and Ethan prepared to leave Silver Creek, they stood together on the edge of town, looking back at the dusty streets, the weathered buildings, the scene of so much turmoil and pain. "What will you do now, Abigail?" Ethan asked, his voice soft. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a newfound strength, a quiet determination. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I know I'm not running anymore. I'm going to build a new life, a life based on truth, on justice, on hope." He nodded, his gaze meeting hers, a silent understanding passing between them. They had both been through hell, but they had survived. They had found each other in the midst of chaos and despair. And they had found a strength, a resilience, a hope that they had never known before. Broken vows and betrayal had led to this moment, a reckoning of the past, and the promise of a future, uncertain but free. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land, but their faces were turned towards the east, towards the promise of a new dawn, a new beginning. Chapter 13. The Long Road to Nowhere and a Moment of Grace. The road stretched before them, dusty and seemingly endless, disappearing into the vast expanse of the horizon. Abby and Ethan rode side by side, their horses' hooves kicking up small clouds of dust that mingled with the dry, desert air. They had left Silver Creek behind, along with the shadows of the past, the accusations, and the betrayals. They rode in silence for a long time, each lost in their own thoughts, their own reflections. The landscape around them was stark and unforgiving, a testament to the harsh realities of frontier life. But there was also a beauty to it, a raw, untamed beauty that spoke to their souls. Abby found herself stealing glances at Ethan, studying his profile, the strong lines of his jaw, the gentle curve of his lips, the way his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, seemed to absorb the vastness of the landscape. He was a man of few words, but his presence was a comfort, a strength, a silent promise of companionship. "Where are we going, Ethan?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. He looked at her, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Does it matter?" She thought about it for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the open plains. "No," she said finally. "I guess it doesn't." They had both been running for so long, from their pasts, from their fears, from their demons. But now, they were running towards something, towards an uncertain future, but a future filled with possibility, with hope. They stopped for the night by a small, dried-up creek bed, setting up a makeshift camp. Ethan built a fire, the flames leaping and dancing in the gathering darkness, casting a warm glow on their faces. Abby prepared a simple meal of beans and hardtack, the aroma mingling with the scent of wood smoke. They ate in silence, the crackling fire and the distant howl of a coyote the only sounds breaking the stillness of the night. The stars above were brilliant, a vast tapestry of light that stretched from horizon to horizon. Abby looked at Ethan, his face illuminated by the firelight, his eyes reflecting the flames. She felt a deep connection to him, a bond forged in the crucible of shared hardship, shared loss, shared hope. "Ethan," she said softly, I don't know how to thank you
For everything you've done for me."
He met her gaze, his expression serious. "You don't need to thank me, Abigail. We've helped each other. We've saved each other." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who had worked the land, the hand of a man who had known hardship, the hand of a man who had become her friend, her protector, her something more. They sat there, holding hands, gazing into the fire, the silence between them filled with unspoken emotions, with a growing tenderness, with a nascent love. A shooting star streaked across the sky, a fleeting moment of brilliance in the vast darkness. Abby made a wish, a silent plea for happiness, for peace, for a future with Ethan. He squeezed her hand, his gaze meeting hers. "What did you wish for?" he asked softly. She smiled, her heart filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I wished for us," she said simply. He didn't answer, but his eyes, reflecting the starlight, told her everything she needed to know. The long road to nowhere had suddenly become a path, a journey, a shared adventure. A moment of grace, under the vast, starlit sky, had transformed their lives, their hearts, their destinies. The fire crackled, a cheerful sound, and the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the dawn. Chapter 14. Whispers of Outlaws and the Shadow of Doubt. Their journey continued, aimless yet purposeful. They were not heading towards any specific destination, but they were moving forward, away from the past, towards an undefined future. They rode through rolling hills, across vast plains, and along winding canyons, the landscape constantly changing, reflecting the uncertainty and the beauty of their lives. One evening, as they were setting up camp near a small, isolated settlement, they overheard a conversation that sent a chill down Abby's spine. Two men, their faces weathered and hardened, were talking in hushed tones, their words carrying on the wind. "Heard the Blackwood gang is riding again," one of the men said. "Raiding ranches, stealing cattle, leaving a trail of blood wherever they go. They're ruthless," the other man replied. "Led by that devil, Silas Blackwood.
He's got a score to settle, they say."
Abby felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. The Blackwood gang. Silas Blackwood. Names that were whispered in fear throughout the territory. Ruthless outlaws, known for their brutality and their utter disregard for the law. She looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with apprehension. He had heard the conversation too, his expression grim, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his shoulder. "We need to be careful, Abigail," he said, his voice low. "This is dangerous territory." She nodded, her heart pounding. She had thought she had left danger behind in Silver Creek, but it seemed that danger was a constant companion on the frontier, a shadow that followed them wherever they went. They continued their journey, more cautious now, more vigilant. They avoided settlements, keeping to the open country, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. One day, as they were riding through a narrow canyon, they came across a scene of devastation. A ranch, or what was left of it, smoldered in ruins. The buildings had been burned to the ground, the fences torn down, the livestock scattered. They found bodies, the remains of the ranchers and their families, brutally murdered. The scene was horrific, a testament to the savagery of the Blackwood gang. Abby felt a wave of nausea, of horror, of a deep, unsettling sadness. She had seen violence before, but this was something different. This was senseless, brutal, a crime against humanity. Ethan, his face pale, his eyes filled with a cold fury, surveyed the scene. He examined the tracks, the signs of the struggle, the evidence of the outlaws' passage. "They were here recently," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Not more than a few hours ago." He looked at Abby, his gaze intense. "We need to warn others," he said. "We need to stop them." Abby hesitated. She was afraid, terrified, of facing the Blackwood gang. But she also knew that Ethan was right. They couldn't just stand by and do nothing. They had to do something, anything, to stop the violence, to prevent more bloodshed. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We can warn the other ranchers," he said. "We can ride to the nearest town, alert the authorities. We can try to gather a posse, track them down." It was a dangerous plan, a risky undertaking. But they had no choice. They couldn't just run, not anymore. They had to stand and fight, for themselves, for others, for the future. As they rode away from the scene of devastation, Abby felt a shadow of doubt creep into her heart. Could they really make a difference? Could they really stop the Blackwood gang? Were they just riding towards another disaster, another tragedy? Ethan seemed to be even more withdrawn, quiet and grim, and the easy silence between them was once again heavy with unspoken worries. The whispers of outlaws had brought a new, chilling element to their journey and a new test of their fragile bond. Chapter 15. A Stolen Kiss and the Confession of Fears. The weight of their mission, the knowledge of the Blackwood gang's proximity, hung heavy between them. The easy camaraderie they had found on the open road was strained, replaced by a tense awareness of the danger that surrounded them. Ethan, already a man of few words, had become even more withdrawn, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from his rifle. Abby understood his concern, his vigilance. She shared his fear, his apprehension. But she also missed the connection they had shared, the quiet understanding, the unspoken tenderness. She longed for a moment of respite, a moment of connection, a moment of reassurance. One evening, as they were setting up camp in a secluded grove of trees, Abby decided to break the silence, to confront the tension that had grown between them. "Ethan," she said softly, "are you all right?" He looked at her, his expression guarded, his eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and concern. "I'm fine, Abigail," he said, his voice flat. She knew he wasn't fine. She could see the worry etched on his face, the tension in his body, the fear in his eyes. "No, you're not," she said gently. "You're worried. We both are. But we can't let fear consume us. We need to trust each other, to support each other." He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the ground. She moved closer to him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "talk to me. Tell me what you're feeling." He looked at her then, his eyes meeting hers, and she saw the vulnerability, the fear, the doubt that he had been trying so hard to conceal. "I'm afraid, Abigail," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Afraid of failing. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of everything." His words struck a chord within her, a deep resonance. She understood his fears, because they were her fears too. "I'm afraid too, Ethan," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But we can't let fear control us. We have to be brave, for each other, for the future." She moved closer still, her body almost touching his. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and longing. "Ethan," she said, her voice a soft murmur. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Her eyes, her touch, her presence, they conveyed everything she was feeling. He understood. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were filled with a tenderness that took her breath away. He leaned down, slowly, hesitantly, as if giving her a chance to pull away. But she didn't. She wanted this, needed this more than anything. His lips met hers, softly, gently, a tentative exploration, a hesitant question. She responded, her lips parting slightly, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more intense, a release of all the pent-up fear, all the unspoken longing, all the burgeoning love. It was a stolen moment, a moment of grace, a moment of connection in the midst of chaos and uncertainty. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their hearts pounding, their bodies trembling. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and awe. "Abigail," Ethan said, his voice husky with emotion, I care for you. Deeply." She smiled, her heart overflowing with happiness. "And I care for you, Ethan," she said softly. "More than I ever thought possible." They stood there, in the gathering darkness, holding each other, their bodies close, their hearts intertwined. The fear hadn't disappeared, the danger hadn't vanished, but it didn't matter. They had each other. They had their love.
And that was enough.
The confession of fears, sealed with a stolen kiss, had brought them closer than ever, forging a bond that even the shadow of outlaws couldn't diminish. The night seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging the sacredness of the moment. Chapter 16. The Unforgiving Land and a Test of Loyalty. Their newfound intimacy, born from shared fear and a stolen kiss, didn't make the dangers of their journey disappear. If anything, the stakes felt higher now, the threat of loss more acute. They continued their ride towards the nearest town, a place called Redemption, ironically enough, hoping to alert the authorities about the Blackwood Gang's movements. The land they traversed was unforgiving, a harsh expanse of desert and rock, baking under the relentless sun. Water was scarce, and they had to ration their supplies carefully. Their horses, Bess and Ethan's sturdy gelding, Scout, were showing signs of fatigue, their pace slowing, their heads drooping. One afternoon, as they were navigating a narrow, rocky pass, disaster struck. Scout stumbled, his leg caught in a crevice, and he went down with a cry of pain. Ethan was thrown from the saddle, landing heavily on the hard ground. Abby rushed to his side, her heart pounding with fear. Ethan was conscious, but he was groaning in pain, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. My leg, he gasped. I think it's broken. Abby examined his leg carefully, her hands gentle but firm. It was definitely broken, a clean break, but a serious one. We need to set it, she said, her voice calm despite the turmoil in her heart. And we need to get you out of the sun. She helped him to a shaded area beneath a rocky overhang, using her cloak to create a makeshift shelter. She gathered some sturdy branches and strips of cloth from their meager supplies, preparing to splint his leg. The process was agonizing for both of them. Ethan bit back cries of pain as Abby manipulated his leg, setting the bone as best she could. She splinted it securely, her hands working with a practiced efficiency that surprised even her. When she was finished, Ethan lay back, exhausted, his face pale and beaded with sweat. Thank you, Abigail, he said weakly. You saved my life. She smiled, her heart filled with relief and a fierce determination to protect him. We'll get through this, Ethan, she said. Together. But the situation was dire. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere, with a broken leg, dwindling supplies, and the threat of the Blackwood gang looming over them. Abby knew they needed help, and they needed it fast. She decided to ride to redemption alone, leaving Ethan in the relative safety of the sheltered pass. It was a risky decision, leaving him vulnerable, but it was their only chance. I'll be back as soon as I can, she said, her voice filled with determination. I promise. Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of trust and apprehension. Be careful, Abigail, he said. Please be careful. She mounted Bess, her heart heavy with worry. She looked back at Ethan, his figure silhouetted against the rocks, his face pale but resolute. I love you, Ethan, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. He smiled, a weak but genuine smile. I love you too, Abigail, he said. She turned Bess and rode away, galloping towards redemption, towards an uncertain future, towards a desperate hope. The unforgiving land tested their loyalty, their love, their very survival. The sun beat down, and the wind whispered a prayer for their safety. She rode on, a solitary figure against the vast, empty landscape, a woman driven by love and a fierce determination to save the man she loved. Chapter 17. Trapped between two worlds and a choice to make. The ride to redemption was a blur of dust, heat, and fear. Abby pushed Bess to her limits, urging the mare onward, her mind focused on the image of Ethan, injured and vulnerable, waiting for her return. When she finally reached redemption, it was late afternoon. The town, a small collection of buildings huddled together in the vast emptiness of the desert, seemed deserted, its streets empty, its windows shuttered. She found the sheriff's office, a small, dilapidated building at the end of the main street. She dismounted, her legs shaky, her body exhausted. She burst into the office, her heart pounding. Sheriff,
she cried.
I need help. My friend is injured. And the Blackwood gang, the sheriff, a young, inexperienced man with a nervous demeanor, looked at her with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. Whoa there, ma'am, he said.
Slow down.
What's going on? Abby explained, her voice frantic, about Ethan's broken leg, about the Blackwood gang's rampage, about the need for immediate assistance. The sheriff listened, his expression growing increasingly worried. The Blackwood gang? He said. They're in this area? That's bad news. He hesitated, his gaze shifting nervously around the room. I don't know what to do, he admitted. I'm just one man. And most of the townsfolk are gone. They fled when they heard about the Blackwood gang. Abby felt a surge of despair, a feeling of utter helplessness. She had ridden so hard, risked so much, and now it seemed it was all for nothing. But then, she heard a voice, a familiar voice, coming from the doorway. I'll help you. She turned and saw a figure standing there, silhouetted against the setting sun. It was a woman, tall and strong, with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes. She wore men's clothing, a gun belt strapped around her waist, and a rifle slung across her shoulder. Who are you? Abby asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and confusion. My name is Sarah, the woman said. And I know Ethan Boone. He's a good man. I owe him a debt. Sarah explained that she was a rancher, living on the outskirts of Redemption. She had heard about the Blackwood gang, and she had been preparing to defend her property. She had also heard rumors of a woman riding into town, seeking help for an injured man. I knew it had to be you, Sarah said. Ethan spoke of you often. He said you were a woman of courage, of strength, of unwavering loyalty. Abby felt a warmth spread through her chest, a renewed sense of hope. She wasn't alone. There were others like Sarah who were willing to stand up to the Blackwood gang, who were willing to fight for what was right. Sarah gathered a small group of men, those who had remained in Redemption, those who were willing to fight. They were a ragtag bunch, farmers, shopkeepers, a blacksmith, but they were determined, resolute, ready to defend their homes, their lives, their futures. They rode out of Redemption, towards the rocky pass where Ethan was waiting, a small band of unlikely heroes, riding against the odds, riding towards a confrontation with the notorious Blackwood gang. Abby rode beside Sarah, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She was trapped between two worlds, the world of fear and the world of hope, the world of the past and the world of the future. And she had a choice to make, a choice that would determine not only her fate, but the fate of Ethan, of Sarah, of all those who are willing to stand up against the darkness. She chose hope. She chose courage. She chose love. The setting sun cast long shadows across the land, a fiery backdrop to their desperate ride, a silent testament to the courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. She wouldn't fail. Chapter 18. The Sheriff's Arrival and the Weight of Justice. As Abby and Sarah's makeshift posse approached the pass where Ethan lay hidden, a dust cloud on the horizon signaled an approaching rider. Abby's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Was it help? Or was it the Blackwood gang, alerted to their movements? As the rider drew closer, Abby recognized the familiar, lanky figure of Sheriff Brody, his face grim, his posture determined. He was riding hard, his horse lathered and breathing heavily. Abigail. He called out, his voice hoarse. Thank God you're all right. He reined in his horse beside her, his gaze sweeping over the small group of armed men and women. What's going on here? Abby quickly explained the situation, about Ethan's injury, about the Blackwood gang's proximity, about Sarah's willingness to help. Sheriff Brody listened intently, his expression growing increasingly serious. I've been tracking the Blackwood gang, he said. They're close. Very close. We need to be ready. He turned to Sarah, his gaze assessing her strength, her determination. You're Sarah Walker, aren't you? I've heard of you. You're a good shot, they say. Sarah nodded, her expression unwavering. I can handle a rifle, she said simply. Sheriff Brody took charge, organizing the small group into a defensive position, utilizing the natural cover of the rocks and the narrow pass. He instructed them on how to fire, how to take cover, how to protect themselves. He then rode with Abby, back towards the small shelter under the overhang. Ethan was awake, his face pale but his eyes alert. He saw Abby and Sheriff Brody, and a flicker of relief crossed his face. Abigail, he said weakly. You came back. Of course I came back, she said, her voice filled with emotion. I told you I would. Sheriff Brody examined Ethan's leg, his expression grim. It's a bad break, he said, but it's been set properly. You're lucky to have Abigail. He turned to Abby. We need to get him out of here, he said. But we need to be careful. The Blackwood gang could be anywhere. They carefully helped Ethan onto Sheriff Brody's horse, supporting his injured leg. Abby mounted Bess, riding beside him, her hand reaching out to touch his, offering a silent reassurance. As they rode slowly back towards the pass, where Sarah and the others were waiting, they heard the sound of gunfire, a sudden, sharp volley that echoed through the canyon. They're here, Sheriff Brody said, his voice tense. Get Ethan to safety. I'll cover you. He spurred his horse forward, towards the sound of the gunfire, his rifle drawn. Abby hesitated, torn between her desire to stay with Ethan and her duty to help in the fight. Go, Abigail, Ethan said, his voice weak but firm. Help them. I'll be all right. She nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She urged Bess forward, following Sheriff Brody, towards the sounds of the battle. The sheriff's arrival added weight, authority, and experience. The weight of justice was also heavy upon them. This was not only about a personal escape or vengeance. This was about upholding the law, protecting the innocent. They rode into a scene of chaos. Gunfire, shouts, the screams of horses. The Blackwood gang, a dozen or more ruthless outlaws, were attacking Sarah's small group, their guns blazing. Abby saw Sarah, firing her rifle from behind a rocky outcrop, her face grim, her movements precise. She saw the other members of the posse, firing their weapons, taking cover, fighting bravely against overwhelming odds. The weight of justice was a heavy burden, but they all bore it, together, in the dust and the smoke and the echoing gunfire of the unforgiving land. Chapter 19. A Farewell Under the Bleeding Sky. Abby joined the fray, firing her pistol at the outlaws, her hand surprisingly steady, her aim true. She had never considered herself a fighter, but the adrenaline, the fear for Ethan, the need to protect the innocent, fueled her courage. The battle raged, a chaotic dance of gunfire, shouts, and the cries of the wounded. Sheriff Brody, a seasoned lawman, fought with a cool efficiency, his rifle shots finding their mark with deadly accuracy. Sarah Walker, a natural leader, rallied her small band of defenders, her voice strong and clear above the din of battle. One by one, the outlaws fell, their numbers dwindling under the combined fire of the defenders. Silas Blackwood, a tall, imposing figure with a cruel face and cold, merciless eyes, fought with a savage intensity, his gun blazing, his voice cursing his enemies. He saw Abby, recognized her from encounter at Ethan's cabin, and a sneer twisted his lips. "You," he spat. "You're the reason for all this. You'll pay for this." He raised his gun, aiming it directly at her. Abby closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But the shot never came. Instead, she heard another gunshot, a single, sharp crack, and saw Silas Blackwood crumple to the ground, a bullet hole in his chest. She opened her eyes and saw Ethan, standing a short distance away, his rifle smoking, his face pale but resolute. He had managed to crawl from his sheltered position, his injured leg dragging behind him, and had fired the shot that saved her life. With Silas Blackwood dead, the remaining outlaws lost their nerve. They scattered, fleeing into the surrounding hills, their dreams of plunder and violence shattered. The battle was over. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the ragged breathing of the survivors. Abby rushed to Ethan's side, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and concern. "Ethan," she cried, "you shouldn't have. Your leg." He smiled weakly, his eyes meeting hers. "I couldn't let him hurt you, Abigail," he said. "I couldn't." Sheriff Brody and Sarah joined them, their faces grim but relieved. They examined Ethan's leg, their expressions concerned. "He needs a doctor," Sheriff Brody said. "We need to get him to Redemption." They carefully helped Ethan onto a makeshift stretcher, fashioned from blankets and branches. They carried him slowly, painstakingly, back towards the town, their hearts heavy with the weight of their victory, but also with the knowledge of the sacrifices that had been made. Several of the townsfolk were dead. Sarah's arm was wounded, but she refused to rest. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of red and orange, a bleeding sky that mirrored the blood spilled on the dusty ground, they reached Redemption. They brought Ethan to the town's doctor, a kindly old man who examined his leg with care. "He'll live," the doctor said, "but he'll need time to heal, and he may always walk with a limp." Abby stayed by Ethan's side, tending to his needs, offering him comfort and reassurance. He was weak, exhausted, but his spirit was unbroken. As the night deepened and the town settled into an uneasy quiet, Abby knew that she had to make a decision. She couldn't stay in Redemption, not anymore. The memories, the violence, the danger, it was too much. She sat beside Ethan's bed, holding his hand, her heart filled with a profound sadness. "Ethan," she said softly. I have to leave. He looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. I know, he said. I knew you would.
I can't stay here, she said.
Not after everything that's happened. I need to find a new life, a new beginning. Somewhere far away from all this. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. Go, Abigail, he said. Find your peace. Find your happiness. You deserve it. And you? She asked, her voice trembling. He smiled, a sad, wistful smile. I'll be all right, he said. I have my land. I have my memories. I have the knowledge that I did what was right. She leaned down and kissed him, a long, lingering kiss, a farewell kiss, a kiss filled with love, with gratitude, with regret. Goodbye, Ethan, she whispered. Goodbye, Abigail, he said. She left then, slipping out into the night, leaving behind the man she loved, the town that had witnessed so much pain, the life she had known. She rode away, under the bleeding sky, towards an uncertain future, but a future filled with the promise of peace, the hope of healing, the memory of a love that had blossomed in the midst of chaos and violence. It was a bittersweet farewell, a necessary parting, a sacrifice made for the sake of a new beginning. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Abby rode for days, putting as much distance as she could between herself and redemption, between herself and the memories of violence and loss. She followed no particular path, guided only by the sun and the stars, her heart heavy with grief, her mind filled with a jumble of emotions. She thought of Ethan, of his courage, his kindness, his quiet strength. She thought of the love they had shared, a love born in the midst of chaos, a love that had blossomed under the threat of death. She thought of the sacrifices they had both made, the choices they had been forced to confront. She knew she had made the right decision, leaving redemption, leaving Ethan. She needed to heal, to find peace, to build a new life. But the pain of separation was a constant ache in her heart, a reminder of the love she had left behind. One evening, as she was setting up camp in a small, secluded valley, she saw a figure on the horizon, riding towards her. Her heart leaped with a mixture of fear and hope. Was it Ethan? Had he changed his mind? Had he come after her? As the rider drew closer, she realized it wasn't Ethan. It was Sarah Walker, the rancher who had helped them in redemption, her face weathered, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and concern. Sarah? Abby said, surprised. What are you doing here? Sarah dismounted, her movements stiff and weary. I came after you, Abigail, she said. I have news. About Ethan. Abby's heart sank. What is it? Is he all right? Sarah hesitated, her gaze meeting Abby's. He's not doing well, she said. The doctor says his leg, it's not healing properly. He's developed an infection. He's feverish, delirious. He's asking for you. Abby felt a wave of guilt, of regret, of a profound sadness. She had left him, abandoned him, when he needed her most. I have to go back, she said, her voice trembling. I have to see him. Sarah nodded.
I know, she said.
That's why I came. I know the way back isn't easy on the heart. I'll take you. They rode together, through the night, pushing their horses to their limits. Abby's mind was racing, replaying all the moments she had shared with Ethan, the laughter, the tears, the stolen kisses, the unspoken promises. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, they reached redemption. The town seemed quiet, peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Abby's heart. They rode straight to the doctor's office, where Ethan lay in a small, dimly lit room. Abby rushed to his side, her heart pounding in her chest. He was lying on a narrow cot, his face pale and drawn, his eyes closed. He was breathing heavily, his body racked with fever. Ethan, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Ethan, I'm here. He opened his eyes, slowly, his gaze unfocused at first. Then he saw her, and a faint smile crossed his lips. Abigail, he murmured. You came back. Of course I came back, she said, her tears flowing freely. I would never leave you. Not again. She sat beside him, holding his hand, her presence a comfort, a reassurance, a silent promise of love. The doctor examined Ethan, his expression grim. "The infection is spreading," he said. "I've done all I can. It's up to him now. And to you." Abby stayed by Ethan's side, day and night, tending to his needs, whispering words of encouragement, sharing memories of their time together. She bathed his fevered brow, spoon-fed him broth, held his hand through his moments of delirium. Slowly, gradually, Ethan began to improve. The fever subsided, his breathing became easier, his eyes regained their clarity. He was still weak, still in pain, but he was alive. He was healing. One morning, as the sun streamed through the window, casting a golden light on his face, he looked at Abby, his eyes filled with a love that transcended all the pain, all the suffering, all the hardship. "Abigail," he said, his voice weak but clear, "don't ever leave me again." She smiled, her heart overflowing with happiness.
"I won't," she said.
"I promise you, I won't." The final confrontation was not one of guns and violence, but one of hearts and horizons. The horizon of their future stretched before them, vast and uncertain, but filled with the promise of a love that had endured, a love that had conquered, a love that would last a lifetime. They would face it together. Epilogue. The years that followed were not without their challenges. Ethan's leg healed, but he walked with a permanent limp, a constant reminder of the battles they had fought, the sacrifices they had made. They settled on Ethan's land, rebuilding the ranch that had been destroyed by the Blackwood gang, creating a home, a sanctuary, a haven from the harsh realities of the frontier. They worked together, side by side, their hands calloused, their bodies weary, but their spirits strong, their love unwavering. They raised cattle, tended to the land, and built a life filled with quiet moments, shared laughter, and a deep, abiding connection. Sarah Walker became a frequent visitor, a trusted friend, a member of their extended family. Sheriff Brody, too, would occasionally stop by, sharing news of the territory, ensuring that justice was being served, that the peace they had fought so hard for was being maintained. The memories of the past, the violence, the loss, the fear, never completely faded. But they were no longer a source of torment, of despair. They were a reminder of their resilience, their courage, their ability to overcome adversity. Abby and Ethan never had children of their own, but they found joy in the children of their neighbors, in the laughter and the innocence that filled their home on special occasions. They became mentors, guides, offering wisdom and support to the younger generation, sharing the lessons they had learned from their own experiences. As the years turned into decades, their hair turned gray, their faces became lined, their bodies grew frail. But their love remained, a constant flame, burning brightly in the twilight of their lives. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over the vast, open plains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ethan took Abby's hand, his touch gentle, his gaze filled with a love that had endured the test of time. "We made it, Abigail," he said softly, his voice raspy with age. "We made it through." She smiled, her eyes meeting his, her heart overflowing with gratitude and a profound sense of peace. "Yes, Ethan," she said. "We made it. Together." They sat there, in silence, holding hands, watching the sun disappear below the horizon, their lives intertwined, their destinies fulfilled, their love a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The vastness of the land mirrored the vastness of their love, a love that had been forged in fire, tempered by hardship, and destined to last for eternity. The stars began to appear, one by one, like tiny diamonds scattered across the velvet cloth of the night, silent witnesses to their enduring love, their peaceful ending, their shared journey. The end.